Hi, my name is Lama Nachman. I'm an Intel Fellow and I lead the Human and AI Systems Research Lab. And I will be talking to you today about human AI collaboration and how we can utilize that to amplify human potential. So, you're all, given that you are in this conference, I'm sure you're all aware of the amazing progress that AI has made and the way that it has scaled into deployment into the real world in all sorts of different applications. And we've seen, fantastic performance, sometimes at even human level recognition of these systems. Again, so basically, as I mentioned, you're all aware of a lot of the issues that we have been seeing, specifically ethical concerns around AI deployment into the world. On one hand, we see great success in terms of being able to deploy AI. On the other hand, we're starting to see a lot of concerns, whether it's around employment or climate or discrimination in these systems and things like that. So one of the areas we've been looking at is, can we actually utilize human AI collaboration to help kind of change the narrative from the perils of human AI competition, basically. And the reason we think that that is actually a reasonable approach is that if you think about it, the capabilities that humans bring to the table are very, very complementary to the capabilities that AI systems bring to the table, right? So humans are able to learn from limited data. They are able to apply their knowledge to novel situations that they have not seen before. And AI systems really struggle with that. But on the other hand, AI systems are able to actually look at tons of data and extract patterns from multidimensional data, things that humans really struggle with. So if you start to think about these opportunities, if you look at any type of workflow and say, okay, well, on one hand, I could focus on a tiny piece of that workflow because it's easy to automate a human out of that loop, or you could look at the complete workflow and say, how would I redesign that workflow in a way where I can bring human and AI collaboration to the table so that, it kind of, they complement each other. Our lab is a multidisciplinary team. So we bring essentially ethnography, design, and AI to try to solve problems that we kind of discover through a lot of the ethnographic research, identify where these unmet needs. And we've done a lot of ethnographic research in these areas, right? So smart home, manufacturing, specifically looking at, Intel fabs as an example. We've done a lot of work in education, both for like early childhood learning as well as, kids in elementary and middle school, and then assistive computing for people with disabilities. So I'll walk you through some of these examples to kind of identify what are the ways that we could imagine AI coming into the table to help amplify human potential. And then I'll kind of reflect on some of the underlying capabilities that need to come into play to make that happen. So the first one I'll speak to is the assistive computing for people with disabilities. And that's an area that we have really started working in more than a decade ago with Professor Stephen Hawking to try to figure out how could we bring a platform together that can take extremely minimal input from, just imagine the equivalent of a push button, right? So if we're able to capitalize on any tiny motion or movement that somebody could make, can we turn that into a full interaction with a system that can enable somebody to use their machines in the same way that we do? And, in the case of Stephen, clearly also be able to speak on the behalf of the user. So, there really, that system was trying to bring kind of multiple notions together, right? Contextual awareness, understanding the specific task that a person is trying to do, essentially surface a few different options, because it's much easier to choose one of a few options rather than go and specify something from the beginning, and use some prediction capability to be able to reduce the amount of interaction that's needed, because every interaction requires a lot of effort. And in the case of Stephen, you could see he was using essentially a proximity sensor that was sitting on his glasses, and we kind of turned his movement of that cheek through that proximity sensor into the equivalent of a push button But if you want to really expand this, and this system is actually out in open source, you want to be able to capture any type of signal. So we have all sorts of different sensors that can hook into this, including a camera that can detect any type of like facial movement. We're also working on anywhere from like EMG to accelerometers, gaze trackers, and most recently on EEG signals to really address the case when people don't have any muscle to actually move. However, if you think about this and where you could push that with much more advanced AI capability is to say, okay, well, rather than just depend on the person trying to, specify letters and select, predicted words and things like that, can we have the system listen in onto the conversation and then start to highlight things for the user that the user can quickly select one of, because that type of an interaction is way more efficient than if you're starting to try to type from scratch through a system like that. And what that does is actually reduces that silence gap, if you will, right? Because somebody doesn't have to wait forever before an utterance is actually uttered out of the system. The problem is, if you think about response generation systems, they're really meant to be kind of an autonomous system, right? And what we're trying to do here isn't to replace the human with a chatbot, but what we're trying to do is enable the human to essentially make the chatbot kind of behave like a puppet, right? So how do you learn from that extremely limited data from that end user, allow the user to actually change the outcomes of these systems through, for example, choosing some of those keywords that then the system could be trained on to then do the right utterances and things like that. And of course, it needs to be extremely efficient when it runs on these end user platforms. So that's an area that we've been doing quite a bit of work in. The second one that I will mention is education. And that really comes from understanding that there's a very good correlation to learning outcomes with engagement. So a lot of the work that we're doing there has been in trying to utilize AI to understand engagement of learners and try to improve engagement. So in the case of older students where they are actually using a content platform, imagine something like a Khan Academy or something along those lines, then it's much harder for the teacher to really understand engagement, right? Because the student isn't engaged with the teacher, they're engaged with their platforms. So one of the areas we've been looking at is, can actually the PC, through a camera and the context of the content platform, understand the student engagement? And from there, essentially be able to help the teacher understand the student engagement and better support the student, or even bring back personalization into the content platform. So we've spent a lot of time in classrooms collecting all sorts of data, trying to figure out whether we can actually understand engagement from that data, and then build models that can detect student engagement, and then actually deployed it into classrooms where we essentially had a treatment class where the teacher will be empowered with that tool, and then a control class where the teacher wouldn't have that. And then try to step back and say, do we actually see a difference in these interventions within these classrooms? And what we actually saw was that you actually do see a difference, because instead of the teacher spending the time hovering around and trying to understand who's engaged or not, or who has issues or not, the teacher can really focus the time on the students that need the scaffolding and the support. Now, that's all interesting if you're actually thinking about students who are engaged with content platform. If you go into a kinder class, for example, you're not going to see that, right? You're going to see kids on the floor playing with manipulatives, looking at blocks and rods and trying to understand tens and ones and practice their numbers through tens and ones that way. So what we try to do is say, okay, well, can we turn the space into a smart space? And can we enable that physical learning with their whole bodies in having this conversational peer learner, which we call Oscar, who could help support the kids in that experience. So now imagine that they kind of walk into the space and they're playing with these manipulatives. And in this specific case, we just happen to have, objects that were designated, flower pots as tens and ones. And then Oscar will actually engage the kids by giving them different numbers based on their ability level. and then the Oscar can then recognize that they did the right thing and then start to actuate that digital environment to kind of bridge that physical and digital environment. And then you could see them essentially go and draw whatever they want and bring back some of that personalization of what they did back into the digital environment. But they can also start to manipulate that digital environment, interact with these objects within the digital environment, and physically start to measure things in that space and try to actually actuate that physical space by jumping around and doing more physical activity as they start to get, for example, that caterpillar to go up that tree. And what's another kind of interesting and exciting thing is actually to make Oscar inhabit that physical world. So as they build things for Oscar, he understands that these boxes are there, can jump on top of these boxes and start to interact with the kids in that way. So clearly this is still early time, and we managed to get a quick deployment just before COVID hit. But some of the early results really look encouraging, right? We're seeing way more engagement. We're seeing engagement with the objects and the space, and more social interactions between the kids, and much more favorable and positive experiences that we're seeing. Again, a lot of more interesting work to be done, but actually bringing in that smart agent that's actually aware of the space is actually helping us improve engagement. The last part that I quickly touch on is the notion of smart spaces in these manufacturing settings. So one of the areas that we work at within Intel clearly is we have all sorts of different tasks that people perform in manufacturing settings. And what we're really trying to do there is, again, turn that space into a smart space that can actually recognize the different things that the people are doing, ingest all of the data from different specs and things like that, and then try to guide the people as they are doing these multi-step human tasks. Highlight where there might be an error, bring relevant information that can help them complete that task. Now, what's interesting there is that, you could also think about that as facilitating human-to-human support, right? Because that AI system is actually watching an expert do that task and bring some of that learning back to a novice as they start to train on these type of systems. Now, I mentioned initially that this was a collaborative approach, right? So it's not just that the AI system is helping the human, but one of the things that we see often in these spaces is that tasks change, environments change, things like that, right? So what we've been trying to do is essentially guide the AI system by the user as the user is using that system, and provide, think aloud and, feedback support to the AI system so that the AI system can learn on the fly and continue to actually improve in situ as it gets used by the user. So, all of these different things that I've talked about, it's not necessarily about, like, what we're really trying to understand isn't necessarily, can you just solve this one problem? But if you start to move towards this notion of a human AI collaborative system, are there certain capabilities that you would need across the board, right? That will make this building of these type of systems easier. So clearly, as you're interacting with people, what you need to do is understand people, understand their intents, be able to converse with them in a multimodal fashion, right? Be able to, understand their emotions in the case of kids, or, aging adults in the home, and so on. So, even though the specific action might be different in a classroom versus a manufacturing setting, when you actually look at what is needed underneath the hood, there is a lot of similarity that we're, hoping to actually capitalize on in these type of systems. And there, you start to look at these multimodal systems, whether, trying to fuse data from different types of sensors like vision and audio and RFID, and trying to figure out what is the best way to actually fuse these modalities in a way that's aware of the uncertainty within the different modalities. We've been doing quite a bit of work to try to build this notion of a contextual aware multimodal dialogue system. So I don't know if you caught that from the Oscar example, but that dialogue system isn't a speech-based dialogue system only, right? Because that system needs to see what the kids are doing, and that whole interaction is physically situated, right? So it needs to understand the actions. And if you've ever seen kids actually converse, they actually don't even speak sometimes when they're responding, right? They'll gesture, they'll nod their heads, they'll do all of that stuff. So what we've been really trying to do is bring a lot of knowledge from the action recognition, from the gestures, from emotions, from everything else that's going on within that scene, and use that as a way to generate, the dialogue, but also actuate the physical space to support that task that we're trying to do. One of the things that we've discovered as we were doing that is that it tends to be really quite problematic to try to actually go and develop for each of the tasks a dialogue system, right? Because you have to go generate tons of examples with intents, label them, and then train these models to actually generate, understand the intent and generate the dialogue. So then what we really try to do is say, okay, well, can we actually bring some limited data initially to pre-train these models, and then essentially be able to bring clustering approaches here to be able to, and data augmentation, to be able to then make the system generate all sorts of clusters automatically, and then use a human in the loop from an interactive labeling perspective to be able to, either attach names to these clusters or merge these clusters or correct things that were clustered. And one of the things that we've noticed in the process of doing that is that you end up actually getting quite a bit of improvement. I mean, we've seen something around about 10% in F1 score improvement with using just 10% of the data, as opposed to if you compared with the supervised approach. So that's an area that we think could be actually quite helpful in terms of trying to turn around these systems very quickly. So finally, I just want to quickly touch on the responsible AI piece of this. So a lot of the things that I've talked about really require intimate interaction with users. There are a lot of vulnerable populations here between kids and people with disabilities and elderly in their homes. So it's really important to be thinking about, we bring in this notion of a multidisciplinary team from the get-go to understand what are the risks and how do we mitigate these risks. We look at privacy very seriously, and we also, some of the innovation there that we've been trying to do is how do we really reduce that gap between what is sensed and what needs to be inferred, right? So when you have elderly people in their homes and they're okay with sensing their activities of daily living, but they don't want a camera in that space because they're concerned about where that raw data is going. So other than, pushing a lot of that processing to the edge, can we actually sense in different ways? So one of the areas we've been looking at is, can we sense through Wi-Fi signals rather than cameras, for example? So we're not capturing things that might be problematic. On the bias side, clearly there are, a lot of tools that, people are using to try to do quantitative analysis and understand where these systems are biased. We've been actually trying to also look at uncertainty estimation and understanding where these systems might, be different than what it was actually trained on. And more importantly, how do we bring the right voices to the table to understand even what bias we're looking for and trying to mitigate. And then finally, on the transparency side, clearly it's important to build these systems in ways that we can understand how they're making these decisions, whether that is through, better algorithms that are able to actually be more transparent, but also not thinking about your whole system as an end-to-end system. But how do you partition it in a way that brings internally much more visibility into how that system is working? So, in the area of uncertainty, clearly, it's kind of a thinking about uncertainty as a first-class citizen in this environment. And the beauty of having a human AI system is that if your system can tell you that it's uncertain, you can actually bring the human into the loop. So one area we've been really focusing on quite a bit is how do you bring better uncertainty estimation, and how do you do better uncertainty calibration, given that you don't necessarily have ground truth for uncertainty. So how do we leverage the relationship between uncertainty and accuracy to help improve that? I know I've gone through a lot, and I was trying to catch up some time for us. So, happy to answer questions if there's time there.